This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. If you're listening in real time, new groups are forming in April of 2018. Reserve your spot today by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 188. Welcome to the 188th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source of information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I recently created a free 3-part video series all about the fertility awareness method and how you can utilize the fertility awareness method to develop body literacy. So to really connect you with your cycles and really understand what's happening in your body. And so if you haven't had a chance to get your copy of my free video series, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to gain access to my 3-part video series all about fertility awareness charting. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. All right, ladies, I have a great episode for you today. I'm really excited to share today's episode. The topic of the day is real food for pregnancy, and I have Lily Nichols on the show. And for those of you who've listened to the show for a while, you may have caught 1 or 5 of her previous episodes. I think this is her 6th appearance on the show, so Lily gets the record for most appearances. But of course, I love chatting with Lily. We always have incredible conversations, and in today's episode, we're really focused on pregnancy nutrition, which is something that I know a lot of my clients really want more information about. I work with a lot of women who are actively trying to conceive, who are planning to conceive in the future, and of course, at some point, a lot of my clients do conceive, and so this is very timely and very relevant. And even if you are just in the stages of preconception, you're not ready to conceive at all, but at some point in the near future, you're thinking about conceiving, all of this information is relevant because ultimately the way that you want to eat during pregnancy is the same way that you're going to want to eat in the preconception phase, because ultimately that's how you optimize your fertility. So all of these things are related. So I'm really excited to share today's episode with you. Now, if you're listening in real time, the next round of my Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program is starting in April of 2018. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information about how to apply. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. Now let's jump into today's episode. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Lily Nichols, back to the show. So for those of you who have listened to the podcast for a while, you might know that this is Lily's record 6th appearance on the show. So Lily, you were the first to have 6 appearances on the podcast. And I'm really excited to have you back. And this time it's even more special because we're here to talk about your new book, Real Food for Pregnancy. And so for those of you who don't know Lily is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, researcher, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition and exercise. And in our very first interview, we spoke about your best-selling book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And so now, some 3 years later, we're here to talk about your newest book, Real Food for Pregnancy. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about nutrition for pregnancy. I get so many questions from listeners who do conceive wondering, well, what do I do now? So I'm really excited to have you here, Lily, so we can talk about what to do now.
Yes, I'm happy to be here.
Well, so let's start. I mean, anyone who wants to hear more about your background can tune into any of the previous 5 episodes. But I wanted to start by asking you, why did you write this book? I feel like there's a lot of different areas you could have focused on, but you chose to focus on pregnancy. And so I wanted for you to share with us why you chose to actually focus on pregnancy.
Yeah, well, when I wrote my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes, I was not expecting the book to become what it is today, which is like very, very popular, has like influenced international policy on gestational diabetes, and has influenced a bunch of different nutrition and obstetrics practices in the United States. I didn't expect it to do that. Within a couple months of publishing, I started getting requests from some clinicians who had been using my book asking me, hey, do you have a recommendation on general prenatal nutrition for a book? Because I think the information in real food for GD would be appropriate for my other clients, but I don't really want to give them a book on gestational diabetes. And so I started looking at the market and seeing what books were out there. And I found there was kind of two camps. There was the books that were just rehashing the conventional guidelines. So like low fat, high carb, limit your meat, limit your fat, low salt, no discussion on quality of foods, and kind of ignoring this whole body of research that has developed over the last 30 plus years, showing like different requirements for nutrients that are, counter to the dietary guidelines. So I couldn't go with those books, because you may as well just go to the government website and follow the prenatal nutrition guidelines they have posted there. Okay. And then the other camp was books that were more in the vein of real food and whole foods, but sometimes the recommendations were like way out there, clearly an author's opinion, and there was no citations to the research to say why they had chosen to make this recommendation. Like, show me the data. Where's the evidence? Why are you suggesting this random dose of this vitamin? Or why are you suggesting this certain dietary way of eating? It just didn't make sense to me. So I couldn't recommend a good one. So a lot of clinicians were actually giving out my book to their regular prenatal clients and saying, hey, you don't have gestational diabetes, but you should eat this way. And I wanted to write this book on prenatal nutrition for a long time, but after publishing Real Food for GD, I got pregnant and I had my own baby. And when you have your own kid, you don't have time really to write. So I didn't have like the mental bandwidth to take on this project until my son was close to a year. So part of it is my own fault in taking the time to sort of chill in maternity leave a little bit to get to writing this book. But the other part of it was I couldn't recommend a good one on the market. And I knew from my own nutrition practice, when people would be referred to me for pregnancy complications and I'd look at a dietary history, a lot of the same problems, dietary issues that tend to cause high blood sugar. So the things I'd be working on with my clients with gestational diabetes were the same dietary patterns I was seeing in these women who had other pregnancy complications going on, like maybe complications is the wrong word, but things that they didn't want to have happening or their doctors didn't want to have happening. I say that because I'm including, a high amount of weight gain, like more weight gain than is expected, which is like a touchy and kind of controversial topic. High blood pressure, swelling and edema, all these different little niggly things were like, they were also related to what they were eating. And so I'd end up giving out very similar nutrition advice and see a lot of their health complaints during pregnancy improve. And so it was kind of like, it was obvious from the get-go that, every woman should have, well-balanced blood sugar and have certain amounts of certain nutrients and whatnot. But it became really clear in my clinical work that, there's a lot of carryover to the way that you eat for somebody who has gestational diabetes to the way that every woman should eat during pregnancy.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about why nutrition is so important. When I was pregnant, I remember my doctor saying, well, it's okay. If you're not getting enough of something, your baby will get it from you. And so I don't think I'm a unicorn. I don't think I'm the only one that's ever received the advice that basically, like, regardless of what happens, like, your baby will get enough. And so why is diet so important? Can't we just supplement? What's the difference?
Yeah, that sentiment on baby will take what it needs from you, it's true to some extent. And then at a certain point when your nutrient stores are depleted, it's not true anymore. Like, yes, you can carry a pregnancy and not have excellent nutrition. I've seen it a lot, actually. People just eating junk food and drinking soda every day and having baked goods made with trans fats, and somehow they're still able to make a human being who's moderately healthy. It's kind of amazing, actually. But is it optimal? And the big thing for me is when, the study of epigenetics, or how our genetic expression is affected by the way we eat, the way we live our life, and actually how a mother eats and how she lives her life and what her baby's genetics sort of turn into, which genes are expressed or not. That area of research has really opened up this whole Pandora's box of ways that we can modify a mother's diet and a mother's lifestyle to really optimize her baby's development. It's more than just having a baby with 10 fingers and 10 toes. It's like, can we improve their brain development? Could we help protect against diabetes and obesity later in their life? Could we protect against high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease? Like, can we give our children a better quality of life? And there's actually a lot of research showing that, yes, we can do that. And so food is absolutely fundamental to a healthy pregnancy and to nourishing a mother and nourishing her growing baby. It's absolutely more than just taking supplements. We didn't have supplements until the last, 100 or 200 years. I mean, most of the vitamins weren't even identified until the early 1900s. So what did humankind rely upon before that point? Food. We relied on food. And food is more complex than just 300 milligrams of vitamin C and 100 IUs of vitamin D. It's this whole complex synergy of nutrients. Some of them we have names for, and some of them we don't have names for, that play a huge role in development. And I'll give you like one tiny, tiny little example, which just shows how behind nutrition is right now. Not at our own fault. It's just the way that science works. We're trying to piece together the whole puzzle from all these little tiny, tiny puzzle pieces, and it takes like decades to figure out why traditional cultures like did what they did. But one example of this is choline, which is a B vitamin-like compound that should be called a B vitamin, but it was identified after all the other B vitamins were identified. We didn't even have recommended intakes for choline until 1998. So that's 20 years ago, okay, fairly recently. We now know that choline is arguably just as important as folate in preventing neural tube defects and helping promote brain development. And we're now seeing that the recommended intakes for choline in pregnancy are probably not enough, because there's a number of supplement trials that use double the quantity of choline for pregnant women and show optimal brain development for babies. They show better placental function for mom. They show lesser chances of preeclampsia at intakes double the amount of what's currently recommended. And this is a nutrient we didn't even really have on our radar. We didn't have recommended intakes until 20 years ago. So the field is just expanding, year by year, new research comes out and we learn new things. And what I find interesting and what I try to do in the book is to tie it back to how does this relate to how traditional cultures ate pre-pregnancy and during pregnancy and postpartum during breastfeeding to promote like the health of their offspring. And there's a lot of overlap with choline, for example. The foods that are rich in choline, the two richest sources, liver and egg yolks, used to be pretty highly prized in some of these cultures. And maybe choline is part of the reason. We don't know. There's a whole bunch of other nutrients in those two foods, but just to use that one puzzle piece from the big picture, maybe it's choline, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you raise several good points there. And I think it's interesting that we seem to be in a time where we're looking at specific, like people want to identify these isolated nutrients and say, like, you need this nutrient and you need this nutrient and you need this nutrient. Whereas when you're getting it from food, as you said, food is more complex. And so you're getting lots of different nutrients at one time. And some of them we don't even know. Some of them we haven't even identified yet.
Right.
So it can feel overwhelming as a woman who's newly pregnant or as a woman who's trying to conceive. There's so many questions that I'm like bursting to ask, but maybe we could start with, how did the dietary requirements change when you get pregnant? And is it different? So is there different advice for a woman who's trying to conceive versus a woman who's pregnant?
Very good question. Technically, nutrient needs do start to go up during pregnancy. However, if we're talking specifically about a woman trying to conceive, it's actually optimal to eat the way that you plan to eat during pregnancy before you even get pregnant. You want to optimize your nutrient stores before you head into pregnancy, if at all possible. And I don't want to like harp on this too much to dissuade anyone who's already pregnant and now suddenly thinking like, oh my gosh, I need to like revamp my food. It still counts what you eat during pregnancy, for sure. We also know that what you eat pre-pregnancy plays a big role in your baby's development, because the first 8 weeks of pregnancy are actually when like all the internal organs are developed. Like the very beginning of that tiny human is like kind of set in those first 8 weeks. So I don't want to like take the tone down a notch, but we kind of have to go to like what happens when we don't get enough of things to talk about why we need to get enough of things. So some of the like structural birth defects, like heart defects, missing limbs, missing fingers, problems with organ development, those all happen in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. So that's why we can go into the whole like folate versus folic acid thing, but just to like keep it really simple, that's why there's so much emphasis on women of childbearing age to get enough folate, is because you want to get enough of that nutrient even before you head into pregnancy, so your nutrient stores are optimal to help your baby develop normally right in those early weeks. Because the way that pregnancy is dated, they count it from your last menstrual period. Technically, you don't actually get pregnant till like at least 2-ish weeks after that, depending on your cycle. And then so by the time you can find out, which is 2 weeks past that, you're already considered 4 weeks pregnant, right? So it's like that window is very short. So optimal nutrient intake pre-pregnancy is best. Eat the way you plan to eat during pregnancy when you're planning to conceive, if at all possible. And then what specifically changes during pregnancy, there's like a number of nutrients that are impacted by pregnancy that go up. Like iron needs go up 50%, iodine needs go up 50%, vitamin A needs go up 30%. We know choline needs go up. The percentage at which they go up is debatable now. They go up. There's like a whole host of different vitamins and nutrients that increase. And it's more that the micronutrients increase while the actual calorie needs don't increase that much. So it just points to the direction of like, we really need to be pushing nutrient density, because you don't necessarily need a whole lot more energy. It's maybe like 300 calories more between not pregnant and like third trimester. That's not very much. It's like a large snack. So we really need to be thinking quality of food, quality of nutrients that go in. And then the one other thing that I'll point out on nutrient needs go up is protein. And this is one that is actually kind of research is showing us that this is different than what the conventional guidelines are by quite a bit. There's a recent study that came out that they directly measured protein requirements in women for the first time ever during pregnancy. This was only in 2015. So again, like I'm saying, like this stuff is actually, people think we know everything and we don't know everything. Anyways, this study found that in early pregnancy, which they defined as less than 20 weeks, actual protein needs were 39% higher than our current guidelines. And in late pregnancy, which they defined as after 31 weeks, they were 73% higher than current guidelines. So protein needs definitely also go up, because protein is absolutely required to build every little building block of human life. Every cell in your body requires protein, and you require all the amino acids and protein to build new cells, both in your body as it's expanding during pregnancy and of course also in your baby.
Well, I'm going to dig into that in a minute. I just wanted to highlight something that you said, because I thought it was really an important distinction to make, that the requirement for macronutrients is there's a kind of like a subtle increase in how many calories that you need, which is not, it's not crazy because you know that whole concept of eating for two.
Yes.
300 calories more. That's interesting. That's not 2,500 calories more, right? That's 300. But then the need for micronutrients dramatically increases. So I thought that was a really important distinction to be made.
Yes.
So maybe you could just share with us some of the basics, like for the listeners who are kind of unclear, like macro versus micronutrients. And also take us through, it's a broad question, but take us through what it means to have a quote unquote healthy diet. Like everyone's eating a healthy diet. I am, you are, your mom is, like everyone you talk to, I'm eating a healthy diet. But obviously all of our definitions are a little bit different. So maybe help us to understand what it means when you say healthy diet during pregnancy so we can be clear on what that actually looks like from your perspective.
Sure. I'll tackle the first point on macro and micronutrients because that's really short. So macronutrients are nutrients that give you energy. So fat, protein, and carbohydrates. Technically, you could count alcohol in here, but we're not going to count alcohol in here in the context of pregnancy. not exactly essential. And micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. So, and you're exactly right. It's the quantity of micronutrients that goes up. And relatively speaking, macronutrients, you don't need that much more because you don't need that much energy. Like there's some studies that show the increase in energy needs is as little as 70 extra calories a day. So the estimates are across the board. We end up at about 300, but some say 70, some say as much as 500. And I think it probably varies woman to woman and at her stage in pregnancy. So just a little interesting aside. On what constitutes a well-balanced diet for pregnancy, you know, as I said, my recommendations differ from conventional guidelines, and a lot of that is related to my, professional experience, but also what I see in the literature. So what I see in the research is that a moderately lower carbohydrate diet, meaning lower than the current recommendations, which are 45 to 65% of calories, which if you look at those, that's like 250 to 420 grams of carbs per day, depending on your calorie needs. I find that a level of carbohydrates, at least half that for most women and less for some others is optimal. And that actually has been shown to optimize micronutrient intake as well. So when they look at pregnant women's diets, the women who eat more starchy foods, like whole grains and like more potatoes and more, especially the refined grains. So, anything made with white flour, essentially, they have lower vitamin and mineral intakes across the board, which makes sense because those foods likely displace the other foods that are more nutrient dense. So when I'm looking at what should make up the bulk of a woman's diet, I'm looking at where are the micronutrients found and how can we get enough of those? And then secondary to that, I would look at the macronutrients. Like where do we end up with the macronutrients? And when you do it that way, you kind of reverse engineer it. You just kind of automatically end up in this sort of moderately lower carbohydrate range. Like I mentioned, protein needs go up. So, around 80 grams of protein in the first trimester for an average weight woman, up to a minimum of 100 grams of protein in the latter half of pregnancy is ideal, and oftentimes like even a little more than that works well for a lot of women. And when it comes to fat, again, when we start reverse engineering where we get these nutrients, take the liver and egg yolks for example, for the choline needs. Like in order to meet your choline needs through food, in order to meet your vitamin B12, your vitamin A, your iron, your zinc, your vitamin K2, in order to meet these needs for those nutrients, by default, your diet ends up being higher in fat. So when people argue about high carb versus low carb, what they're really arguing about is high carb, low fat versus low carb, high fat, because those are the two nutrients that tend to be in flux. Protein can stay relative, like it's hard to overeat protein, but when you do eat like the right amount of protein and you're not artificially removing fat from your food, meaning you're not eating low fat dairy, you're not taking the skin off your chicken, you're not cutting the fat off your steak, you're not throwing away the organ meats, you're eating them. By default, you end up with a slightly lower carb, slightly higher fat, moderate protein diet. So if we're talking about it in big macro terms, that's what I'm looking at. What it looks like for actual food is that, you know, your diet, most meals should contain a pretty decent quantity of protein, you know, probably 3 to 4 ounces ish for an average woman. And typically those will be animal sources of protein. So it may be eggs, it may be meat, it may be fish, and maybe some dairy products. It can also include like nuts and beans and seeds. Those are fine too. And then you get some carbohydrate foods in there. Whether or not those are super high glycemic carbohydrates or not depends on many factors in your body, but your carbohydrates could come mostly in the form of vegetables, or they could come also in the form of maybe a small amount of whole grains or beans or fruit or something like that. And then enough fat to cook all of said foods so that A, your food tastes good, and B, you're satisfied when you eat. So I know this is like really broad and it's hard to put into food terms, but like I include meal plans in the book so people can actually see in the real world, like, what does this look like? What is Lily talking about? To hopefully make it a little clearer.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what are some of I think what I like about the conversation of defining the difference between micronutrients and macronutrients and separating out the concept of food as energy kind of versus food as nutrition. If you're eating around the same amount of calories and you're trying to increase the amount of nutrition that you're getting, then it really calls into question what you're choosing to put into your body. And so then, you know, the way I look at it, the question then becomes, what foods are giving me the biggest bang for my buck in terms of nutrition? So like I can have a French fry or I could have something else. And so it's like, what are the foods then that have the highest density of nutrition? Maybe you can just share some of the foods that you recommend that we should be incorporating on a regular basis so that we can get those key nutrients.
Yeah, I love this question. So I have a whole chapter on this topic. I call it Foods That Build a Healthy Baby. I used to work for a perinatologist, so it was a high-risk obstetrics practice, and I did a lot of gestational diabetes work there, along with a lot of other pregnancy complications, and then a handful of women who didn't happen to have complications. It was a relatively low literacy population, so I would keep my descriptions of things really simple and really easy for anybody of any education background to pick up on. And I think a lot of this whole concept of foods that build a healthy baby and foods that don't help build a healthy baby are kind of obvious, you know. So I would just ask them, do you think that food builds a healthy baby? And they'd look at it and be like, no, this soda probably isn't good for my baby. No, that cake probably isn't good for my baby. Like, some of it is actually very obvious. So I'll state that first of all. The challenge is, because of our dietary programming on what we've been taught is healthy or not healthy, sometimes the foods that actually are really good for your baby aren't as obvious. Like, everybody agrees on vegetables. Eat your vegetables. Yeah. All good. It gets complicated when you start talking about other foods that maybe were taboo because our dietary guidelines kind of put the scarlet letter on foods that contain fat and especially like animal proteins, whatever. But again, when you start to reverse engineer, where do we get the B12, the iron, the zinc, the DHA, the choline? I could go on and on. That almost always points to foods of animal origin. So a short list of foods that are very, very good: eggs, which I already touched upon. The choline thing is a huge reason. People who eat eggs tend to have double the intake of choline compared to non-egg eaters. So if you're at all concerned about not getting enough choline, which I think every woman should be concerned because it's a hard nutrient to get enough of, like 94% of women do not even meet the current recommendation, which is like half of probably what we should be aiming for. So like everybody who needs to be thinking about choline, aside from people who have like an egg allergy or something where they cannot eat eggs, every woman should be eating eggs. Okay. Very, very good source of choline, a good source of DHA and omega-3 fat that's helpful for brain and eye development for your baby, vitamin E, vitamin A, vitamin D. There's a variety of nutrients in there that are very, very helpful. Eggs are always on my list, and almost everybody likes this. It's an easy food for people to incorporate usually. Liver is another one. Liver and organ meats. Technically, we could include all organ meats in this conversation, but liver has the most research behind it. Liver is the second top food source of choline other than eggs. It's a little bit tougher for people to incorporate because it tastes like liver, which it's, that organ filters blood. So it tastes like blood. It tastes irony. And a lot of people are kind of averse to the flavor. So I have, tips in the book for how to get around that. But liver is probably the most nutrient dense food on the planet. So high in like everything and in very well absorbed forms. So other than choline, it's very high in iron and zinc. If a woman is prone to anemia, liver would be by far your best source of iron. Another really good source would be oysters, although I recommend cooked oysters. We can go into food safety stuff. Yeah, the iron is like off the charts for liver. It also has a ton of folate and a ton of vitamin B12, really helpful for brain development, really helpful for preventing those neural tube defects. If you can eat it pre-pregnancy, even better, because you probably won't have as many food aversions. But like on the B12 side of things, ounce per ounce, liver has like 200 times more B12 than muscle meat does. So there are always other food sources to get a lot of nutrients, but liver is just super, super, super concentrated, which also means that you don't need to eat an enormous quantity to reap the benefits. So if you can only get a bite or two in, that's still really, really good. It's also really high in fat-soluble vitamins, so A, D, E, and K, which are fantastic for pregnant women. Some other ones, fish, especially fatty fish and seafood, that's going to be your top source of DHA. Really good for baby's brain development, and also really good for you, just keeping inflammation levels down. Can help with preventing certain pregnancy complications that are associated with inflammation, like preeclampsia. So that's fantastic. Also has iodine, which we can talk a bunch about iodine too. Very important for your baby's brain development and for your thyroid health. Another food on the list would be meat on the bone, slow cooked meat and bone broth. There's a whole bunch of benefits to meat itself, but a specific nutrient I want to highlight found in these foods is an amino acid called glycine, which is important for collagen formation, which is involved in your own and your baby's like hair, skin, nails, and internal organs. It's also involved in like the transcribing of DNA. So like how well your baby's genetics. Yeah, it's kind of a big deal.
Kind of important.
Glycine is so important that it becomes what's called conditionally essential during pregnancy, meaning outside of pregnancy, most people don't even think about it, but during pregnancy, you have to get it from your diet. And this glycine needs are like not even mentioned in conventional prenatal nutrition policy. I hadn't even heard of glycine until I started looking into the research deeper myself. That wasn't in my training as a dietitian at all. I mean, it's like mentioned when you learn the amino acids. You don't learn its role in pregnancy. It's very, very, very important to get enough glycine. It can help with better blood sugar and blood pressure for mom, and also all those other things for baby. So especially the skin, organ development, and skeleton, kind of important. And the main places you get glycine is the bone, skin, and connective tissues of animal foods. So by far, vegetarian sources are very, very low in glycine. So you really do need to include some of these foods to get enough. I could keep going on foods. I think I have one more category, which I'll just stop at this one. Full fat and fermented dairy products, unless you have some issue where you cannot consume dairy or really do not like dairy, I think it is actually a good thing to include while you're pregnant. And interestingly, I know that a lot of women who don't eat dairy suddenly feel compelled to eat dairy during pregnancy, or like they identify themselves as lactose intolerant outside of pregnancy, but in pregnancy, they want like all the milk and all the yogurt and all the cheese.
And all the ice cream.
And all the ice cream.
I'm saying it because it's a real thing. I think a lot of women are surprised that they want ice cream. And what I say is, well, where else are you getting your butterfat from?
That's true. For women who are really fearful of fat, yeah, ice cream would be a really good source, sadly. Yeah, so on that point, full fat dairy will have a lot of fat soluble vitamins, which are important for a variety of things with baby's development and with your health in pregnancy. You get calcium, you get an excellent source of protein. If it's fermented, you get a lot of probiotics. Depending on how the cows are raised, it's actually a very good source of iodine. Eggs and dairy are like your top two sources of iodine for people who don't eat much seafood. Seafood is like number one by far, but dairy and eggs fill the gap for a lot of people. So that's really an important point. On the probiotic side of things, probiotics are super important to pregnancy, super important for your developing baby, because the whole community of microbes, which forms, our whole immune system and affects many other different systems in the body, is actually like your baby gets it from you, and it starts in utero and then is further seeded, hopefully during birth, if you're able to deliver vaginally. So a lot of people are not really into the non-dairy fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi. So if that's you, you maybe want to look in the direction of like yogurt or a naturally fermented cheese, because you'll get your probiotics that way. Kefir too. So I could go on and on, but those are some of the top ones.
I think we have to address the question of a vegetarian or vegan diet, because I've had a lot of, I think some of the podcast episodes and some of the blog posts that I've written that are the most contentious and have the most colorful conversations around it is the issue of vegetarian vegan diets. And so one of the things I appreciate about your work, Lily, is how you really challenge your own assumptions by actually delving into the research and seeing what it says and getting a really clear understanding, not just from your own opinion, but actually what has been, like, has it been studied and how does this react in the body and all that. So based on what based on all of your knowledge of research, and I know you have a section in your book that specifically addresses optimizing a vegetarian diet if you are a vegetarian. So the question then is, given that we just went through a list of foods, and so initially I was asking, how do we optimize, what is the optimal diet for pregnancy? What are some of the key foods that you would recommend because of their nutrient density? And you took us through a list of animal foods. And so for the woman who's listening, who is a vegetarian, is a vegan, and is wanting to know what she can do, maybe we can just start there, because can she get enough nutrition from a diet that doesn't incorporate animal products?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And this is something that I actually tried to shy away from even tackling in the book, because it gets so contentious. But again, like you were saying, and I appreciate the compliment, I really had to challenge my own thoughts about it and really dig into the literature to see, is a vegetarian diet optimal, or are there potential problems with it? What is interesting is that conventional guidelines say that a vegetarian diet can be appropriate for pregnancy with like a few considerations and a few supplements, and then you're like good to go. Or sometimes not even supplements, but like fortified foods, which I guess arguably could be the same thing. What I found from the research did not support that a vegetarian diet is optimal in pregnancy. I think vegetarian specifically, which means a diet that doesn't have animal foods with the exception of dairy and eggs, so a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet, could, with very careful planning and some supplementation, work. Like you can make that work. A vegan diet, I feel ethically as a dietitian, knowing what I know, I could not ethically recommend a vegan diet during pregnancy. So the big challenge with a vegetarian diet is that there are a lot of nutrients that are difficult to obtain. So the short list is vitamin B12, that's only available in animal foods, choline and glycine, available in plant foods, but not in sufficient quantities. Preformed vitamin A, also known as retinol, not available in plant foods. Vitamin K2, technically that's produced by bacteria, so it can be found in fermented vegetarian foods, but probably the only way you're going to meet your vitamin K2 needs is to eat a very stinky, slimy, weird fermented soy product called natto, which outside of Asia is not very commonly consumed. I've eaten it. It's weird. I probably wouldn't have been able to eat it during pregnancy. So other than that, most people get it from dairy products. DHA, that special omega-3 fat, only available in animal foods with the exception of a specific type of algae-derived DHA supplement. And then the other two are iron and zinc, available in plant foods, but in very poorly absorbed forms, and they're consumed alongside other nutrients in these plant foods that further prevent their absorption. So I could go into all the details if you want. It would take a long time. The section in this book, which I was hoping would just be like, I was thinking, maybe I'll just leave it at a paragraph or two and just, we're good. And I was like, no, like the more I kept reading, the more I was compelled to actually write down all the information and put it in there so people actually can make an informed decision and not just take my word for it. I don't like taking anybody's word for it, by the way. So I decided to just go there hardcore, and it turned into like a 3-month project to really lay out all the evidence. I think one of the interesting things is that if we kind of take a step back from this whole argument, because there's all sorts of arguments to eat fully plant-based or not, and I'm very familiar. I have been vegetarian before. I have very close family members who are vegan, thankfully, who are choosing not to have children, so I'm a little less concerned. But I respect the decision on, ethical or religious grounds to not eat animal foods. I just can't say that it's optimal for preparing for or caring for a child, or if we really want to get into it, for producing nutrient sufficient breast milk for said child, which is a huge concern. But if we really take a step back to, like, does this make sense in the context of human history? Like, were other cultures eating vegan diets during pregnancy? We actually see that there was a really interesting study out in 2011. It looked at modern hunter-gatherer populations worldwide. So these are ones that are still living. It was like over 200 of these tribes. And they found that animal foods provided between 55 to 65% of calories in their diets. Would those people living in a time when they didn't have fortified foods and processed soy foods and all these other things that tend to become, a bigger component of plant-based diets, like, would they have been able to stay healthy and reproduce successfully? I'm not sure. The research from Dr. Weston Price back from the 1920s, which I know a lot of people like to dismiss because, well, it's only one guy. So, could we replicate the studies? Well, kind of no, because a lot of those populations are no longer living. But nonetheless, in Dr. Weston Price's search, he went around the globe and documented traditional diets. I know you've talked about him on a bunch of other podcast episodes. He was unable to find an indigenous population that ate an entirely plant-based diet. And what I lay out in the book is point by point, nutrient by nutrient, why this might be and what are the actual effects on, like, nutrient stores, pregnancy outcomes, and infant outcomes in women who are eating this way. And it's just very, very easy to fall short on a variety of nutrients, and supplements become really important.
Well, a question for you, because I know that, I get lots of interesting comments, as I'm sure you do as well. And so even what you said earlier, I have a close family member who is vegan, but she's not having children, thankfully. And so I know that there's a listener who heard that and kind of is just tuned out the whole thing because there's, that's just how it is. And of course, I've interviewed Sally Fallon Morell a couple of times on the podcast, and she she has no problem sharing her opinion that if a person is choosing to have a vegan diet, that she doesn't feel that it's sufficient diet for a healthy pregnancy. So what do you say to the women out there? There are a lot of women who are vegan and who have babies. I don't know how many babies. And, there's a lot of people out there that are saying this is a valid choice. And is it possible to supplement the difference? I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Maybe not is my answer. For a woman I actually have a section called Tips to Optimize a Vegetarian Diet. I mean, I was going through nutrient databases, looking at the amounts of different nutrients and what would actually be needed to make this sufficient or not sufficient. If you only go by conventional guidelines when deciding if it's sufficient or not, the answer is easy. You just supplement with B12, you take your algae-based DHA, and you're good. But when we start looking at what's optimal, take, for example, the new research on vitamin B12, showing that vitamin B12 needs during pregnancy are triple the current dietary guidelines, or the information on choline saying we probably need double the amount, then you start to sort of take a step back and be like, okay, well, maybe some of these arguments saying that this is adequate don't exactly stand up. So let me go through a couple things that I think would be really important for a woman who still chooses to be vegetarian. And by the way, I had an interesting advanced reviewer of the book who was vegetarian and had recently went through a miscarriage. I didn't know that when I had people, readers on my blog, apply to be advanced reviewers so I could get their feedback and improve the book, improve the manuscript. And so I didn't know this story when she read it. And she said afterwards, a lot of the information in the book was hard to read, but at the same time really had her taking a long and hard look at her choices and why she had made certain food choices, and could those food choices have played a role in her loss. And it's terrible to think about, but if we just go purely objectively from the data, you see higher rates of miscarriage in women who are undernourished, specifically choline, B12, iron, all of those. I could probably list more, but those are ones where I actually have the citation floating in my head for those studies if people want it. That increases the odds of miscarriage. And isn't that just, nobody wants to lose a baby. And it just breaks my heart that the way that people have been swayed to eat by whatever they have read or been told, or whatever silly Netflix documentary they've watched, could actually result in a loss of life. That just is awful. So anyways.
Well, and can I just interject for just one second? Because even so, just as an example, because I feel like as women, one of the things that's missing from our education and from everyone's education is how critical a time that this is in our lives. So, from my perspective, I don't think there's a time in our lives that we require as much nutrition as when we're creating human beings.
That is absolutely true. And it's even higher when you're breastfeeding. So remind me to circle back, because I do think we should talk about the whole B12 issue. So
yeah, I just think that women drastically underestimate. We all do. We drastically I eat meat every day, and I had low iron in my third trimester, and I eat liver all the time too. I had to increase my liver consumption in my third trimester when I had my second child. I'm just putting that out there because all of you who listen to the show know how much I like liver, and if I could be if I could be iron deficient in my third trimester and I'm eating liver on a regular basis, just saying.
Yes.
Hashtag just saying.
Hashtag just saying. I, I agree with you. For the listeners, though, I do think it'd be helpful just for me to run through a couple things. I'm like looking at my tips to optimize a vegetarian diet, and I have very long paragraph like bullet points. So probably too much to cover, but to keep it quick, eat eggs every day, like literally 3 eggs every day. That meets a huge number of nutrient needs that otherwise would be missed if you were not having that animal protein. So eggs, absolutely. Eat seaweed, especially. So that provides iron, trace minerals, iodine, specifically spirulina. And I know there's a lot of plant-based eaters that are big on spirulina. It's a type of blue-green algae. I'm not shy about like being gung-ho for a bunch of foods that are popular on plant-based diet. Like I've eaten that way before. I cook that way for family members. It's like I can do it, right? Spirulina it's kind of green slime, but it usually comes in like a powdered form. Spirulina is an excellent source of iron and trace minerals. There's actually a really interesting study showing that spirulina was like better at preventing anemia than the standard, supplemental, poorly absorbed supplemental iron. So spirulina is like a great superfood if you can get it in. It also is like your best plant source of glycine. Still contains like at least a third less than what you'd find in like pork rinds or bone broth or collagen or gelatin powder, but it is going to be one of your best plant sources. So if you can incorporate a minimum of half a cup of spirulina powder into your diet a day, so probably in the form of a smoothie or something, that's actually a lot. There's a lot of spirulina.
That is a lot of spirulina.
You'll be like way closer to meeting your nutrient needs. Like if for whatever reason I was going to do a vegetarian pregnancy, I'd be like chugging the spirulina. Soak and or sprout or ferment your whole grains, beans, and legumes before cooking. That drastically reduces the phytic acid, which is a compound that inhibits mineral absorption. So that'll optimize your absorption of zinc and iron. It still is like doesn't even come close to the absorption of heme iron, which is the type of iron you get from animal foods, but it still greatly enhances it. And then furthermore, eat those foods with something acidic, like something that has tomato or lemon juice or vinegar in it, as that enhances iron absorption as well. Definitely eat full fat dairy products. If you're going to be vegetarian, I think it's not a good idea to also be dairy free, because that's going to be a very important source of preformed vitamin A. Like that and egg yolks would be your only sources of preformed vitamin A, which we didn't even talk about the conversion of that, but plant sourced vitamin A is simply not sufficient for the vast majority of people for genetic reasons. You can't convert beta carotene or other carotenes to vitamin A in sufficient quantities. And then I'm just kind of glossing over things because some of my recommendations are to kind of question your reasons for being vegetarian. So if your reason for being vegetarian is like an ethical decision on like not wanting to harm another life, some vegans actually make the argument that oysters are appropriate because oysters don't have a central nervous system, so they don't feel pain. So if that is in line with your reasons for being vegetarian, absolutely eat the oysters and have them like 3 times a week, because they are a huge, amazing source of iron and vitamin B12. Like if you could eat oysters several times a week, you might not even need an additional B12 supplement as a vegetarian. They're just fantastic source of nutrition. So oysters, I know it's not really like plant-based, but if you can do it. And then there's a few others. I'm probably going to miss some of them, but an algae-based DHA supplement for sure. Really be diligent on your prenatal vitamin and take a really high quality, higher potency one. Absolutely. And then there's a whole supplement section in my book that will, cover other supplement needs, but that would probably fill in a lot of the gaps. You just have to be like uber diligent that you do it every day, which I'm not sure happens because of nausea and food aversions and all the other things that get in the way when you're pregnant. But I think that would help. I want to stop really quickly though to talk about the B12 thing. I know we're probably going over time, but I think this is important because you kind of brought up that, pregnancy is this time that's so important for meeting your nutrient needs. I would argue that breastfeeding is just as, if not more important as during pregnancy. The stats are that most vegetarian women breastfeed. More vegetarian women on average breastfeed than omnivorous women. So with that said, you want to be sure that the way you're eating is not only meeting your needs during pregnancy, but will also leave you with sufficient nutrient stores to provide enough nourishment in your breast milk. And this is something that is like super taboo to talk about. People hate talking about like how nutrients affect breast milk. Wait, we did a whole show on this, didn't we? I just remembered that. So go to that show. But what I found really interesting is that there are at least a dozen case studies in the medical literature of infants of vegetarian or vegan women who became severely vitamin B12 deficient and developed problems as a result. So some of the problems that can happen with vitamin B12 deficiency, because like a mother's B12 stores start to like run out after a couple months unless she's consuming sufficient amounts. And so it usually shows up in infants around the same time that like iron deficiency shows up. So like 4 to 6, 7-ish months after they're born. And the things that happen when B12 is severely deficient are developmental delays, stunted growth, and motor problems. And some of these effects are irreversible. In fact, they're irreversible in about 40 to 50% of cases, which is crazy. And it wasn't just one case study. I'm talking at least a dozen. So if you choose to eat this way, you absolutely need to be supplementing with vitamin B12. And it probably needs to be at least triple what the current RDA is set at. And you definitely need to continue that postpartum when you're breastfeeding. Vitamin B12 is just one example. It's one that is a deficiency that's easily identified, that has clear signs and symptoms, that if they replenish the infant and it hasn't been too long or it didn't get too bad, it is sometimes, maybe in half of the cases, reversible. So we can like see a cause and effect situation. But I would wager there's likely a number of nutrients that also play a role in this that just simply haven't been identified and studied. So I think it's just really crucial that we take this conversation of, dietary choices beyond just this is a choice for you. And the reason I brought up thankfully this relative who's vegan is not planning to have children is that your diet affects more than just you when you're pregnant and when you're nursing. And you want to take that into consideration because some of the effects could actually affect this new human being for the rest of their life. So,
well, and I don't know
this isn't an easy conversation.
No.
And people get uber emotional about it. But again, I just have to bring it back to the objective data. And that's why I took so much time researching and citing literally every single sentence in that section. So you can go to the research yourself and fact check me. But plant-based is not optimal during or after pregnancy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, there's several things I appreciate. I think one of the things I appreciate is that you did go ahead and kind of outline like things that you can do. So tangible things that you can do to increase your consumption of certain key nutrients. I feel like there is something that I would like for you to touch on, and that might be a good place to end today, which is that it often seems like we're just straight up attacking vegetarian and vegan diets. But if you kind of look between the lines, it's fair game all around. The solution isn't just go eat meat, because if you kind of think back to what we talked about at the very beginning and you outlined the foods that have the highest density of certain nutrients, most people don't eat those foods on a regular basis. It's not like eggs. Yeah, people eat eggs, but like the foods that you outline, like especially liver and organ meats, those are not part of most people's diet. So the message isn't like, just go eat meat. The message is, how can we optimize our nutrient absorption. I feel like that's an important distinction to make, because a lot of those nutrient deficiencies that you're talking about, it's entirely possible for a woman to have similar nutrient deficiencies even if she's eating meat on a regular basis. No?
It's true. Statistically, more so on a vegetarian diet. So like even a not very good omnivorous diet is still going to provide more, or at least some of some of these nutrients that would be missing or not supplied in as absorbable forms on a fully vegan diet. Like, for example, there was a study that looked at B12 deficiency in vegetarians and non-vegetarians, and 62% of vegetarian women were deficient in B12, but it was pretty uncommon in the omnivorous women. There was another one that looked at vegetarians, low meat eaters, meaning people who ate less than 10 and a half ounces of meat per week, and omnivorous women. And they found that all the omnivorous women met the RDA. 94% of the low meat eaters met the RDA, but 60% of the vegetarians, only 60% of the vegetarians met the RDA. And then they looked at markers of B12 deficiency, and it followed a similar pattern. Like more than double the amount of vegetarians were deficient by markers of like serum vitamin B12 levels compared to the low meat eaters. And even the low meat eaters were 3 times more likely to be deficient in vitamin B12 than the women who ate an omnivorous diet. So that study perfectly illustrates how our RDAs are not perfect because the majority of them were meeting the RDA and a lot of them were still deficient. So it's just something to really just think long and hard about your reasons for choosing to eat a certain way, and even what you choose to eat. Like, as you mentioned, there's certain foods that are more nutrient dense. So if you're okay with eating eggs, for example, if you ate eggs from pasture-raised chickens, they actually have more vitamin A, more vitamin D, and more omega-3s than chickens that are raised in conventional standards. If you are a plant-based eater and you choose to include oysters in your diet, oysters are way more nutrient dense than like boneless, skinless chicken breast, and they don't feel pain. So it's like a win-win. If you are averse to like meat itself, but you're thinking about this whole glycine needs thing, maybe you could make bone broth. If it's about like not wanting to consume more, a lot of butchers literally throw away bones because not enough people want them. You can buy them for ridiculously cheap. You are honoring that animal's life because you're not letting this part of their body go to waste. You're turning it into food, and a uber valuable nutrient dense food at that. Maybe consider including bone broth in your diet. Or some women are more open to having fish, even if like muscle meat kind of, turns their stomach, or for whatever reason is not, they don't want to do. So fish would be, a good source. Maybe you could go with, I don't know. It depends on on all the reasons for being vegetarian, because like, as my family member would say, I was talking about how I got, a cow share and how this was like our meat for the whole year. And she was like, well, I guess that's more ethical than having chicken all the time, because then you'd be like killing so many more chickens. Whereas with the cow share, it was only one animal. So it was like we harvested one animal to like last us for the whole year. And so like that ethically was like a step above eating a bunch of smaller things. So if that holds true for you, maybe you'd feel better having salmon versus sardines because you're like taking more lives. I don't know. It ends up in this strange argument about ethics and what lives you value more than other lives, and which is just not a conversation that is relevant to this discussion, because I want to keep it on the nutrition side of things. But for women who are really thinking about it, like what would fit within your belief system that would still allow you to be nourished? Like, I'm worried about the nutrition. The other stuff is all secondary, and that's for you to sort of work out in your own code of ethics or decisions about eating what works for you.
Well, yeah, and this is a complicated discussion, and if I think that it's really, I think the challenge is that now there's a lot of voices in the vegan community. There's a lot of vegan bloggers and vegan authors and vegetarian bloggers and authors where this is not only their belief system, but it's also their livelihood. And so it's really important to question the sources that you're reading. And it just gets into this ridiculous discussion. But the challenge for me, even, I've had listeners request that I have vegan bloggers on the show to show how you can have a successful vegan pregnancy. And my challenge is that when you actually read what the research has to say about these nutrients, it's exactly what you said. Like, if you actually read what the research has to say, it makes it hard to suggest that to a woman, because I feel like after the conversation that we've had today, it feels like it's a chance. So it's important to make an informed decision, and it's important to go into it. But this would be a situation where you're more likely to be deficient in certain nutrients, and so you'd have to be extra vigilant to make sure that you are okay.
Exactly.
And so
if a woman had been working with a functional medicine practitioner and has run like a full micronutrient panel pre-pregnancy, had her iron tested, had her thyroid tested, had her vitamin D tested, have all of these things tested and laid out ahead of time, your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, that's something we didn't even touch upon, then you'd be set up. You'd be going into your pregnancy knowing, okay, I have pretty good nutrient stores. I just have to keep it up. Like I said, the huge challenge is that the reality is most women have some level of nausea and vomiting and some level of food aversions. And oftentimes that means they're just eating more carbohydrates, more processed carbohydrates, especially in the first trimester. Somebody who has really good nutrient stores can kind of get through that time and still do okay. Somebody who has kind of marginal nutrient stores, that's when you start to see things get compromised. So, and not everybody is able to keep taking their supplements during that time either.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had nausea, but I couldn't take my prenatal vitamin for a while.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was one of those lucky unicorns that didn't have any morning sickness. But even if your nutrient stores are good at the beginning, again, the part of that vigilance would be actually continuing to monitor that and make sure that it continues to be okay.
Yes.
So I feel like that's probably a good place to end. Because I kind of had an opportunity to look at the preview copy of your book, I had like all of these questions. And so I didn't actually even have the vegan vegetarian conversation in my list of points, but I felt the need to kind of go into it because especially I always think of what the listener is going to be asking. So I always think of what, like, as every time I'm doing an interview, I'm actually sitting here as the listener thinking like, what would you want to know? What would you want to know? And I felt like given where we were going, we needed to kind of go into that and talk a little bit about why so many of the recommendations from a food perspective are coming directly from animal food. So I really appreciate you taking us through that today, Lily.
You're welcome.
So why don't you tell the listeners where they can go to find out more about your book? And I think at the time this airs, it's going to be right around release. At the time we're recording, your book is available for pre-sale, but I think by the time it goes live, the book will actually be live.
Yeah, we should be live. Be live by the end of February. You can find out more about the book at realfoodforpregnancy.com. I am giving away a copy of the first chapter for free over there if you want to get sort of a inside scoop into why I wrote the book and the direction that the book goes and my style of writing to see if you like it or you hate it. That chapter, the excerpt that I have up on the site actually includes more than chapter 1 because I couldn't just leave it at that. The excerpt that's included, I think the key thing that people will really like the most is I take you through a conventional nutrition meal plan and a real food one. I just took a random example from my book and ran a nutrient analysis on it. And you can see which nutrients are higher and how much higher. And in some cases, it's substantial. So if you want the data in black and white of why it makes sense to eat this way during pregnancy, it's spelled out for you right there in that section. So yeah, hopefully people will take advantage of that. And I hope you enjoyed the book.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, Lily. As always, record 6th appearance. It was a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page over at fertilityfriday.com/188. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Lily. It was great to have her on the show once again, and especially this time to talk about her newest book, Real Food for Pregnancy. And so if you are newly pregnant or if you are trying to conceive, it's a great resource. Not only does it provide you with the nutritional guidelines and recommendations for pregnancy, but it also provides you with the sound scientific backing as to why she's making the recommendations that she is. And so if you're anything like me, science-minded, a little bit on the nerdy side, and really wanting that evidence-based information, it's a really great resource to have. And in addition to that, she goes into a lot of other topics. It's a well-rounded pregnancy book that not only talks about nutrition, but actually you also get insights into other things like toxins that you should be aware of and recommendations for how to manage some of the common issues that come up during pregnancy. Balancing blood sugar during pregnancy gets a nod in her book, of course, because she wrote Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And in addition to that, she talks about the postpartum period, which is really nice because I think that one of the things that I found, especially doing the work that I do, supporting women with their cycles, with fertility, is that we're always thinking about ways to ensure we have the healthiest children. And of course, that's extremely important. That's what this is all about. But, it's just as important for mom to be healthy because ultimately that baby needs someone to take care of him or her. And so what I really appreciate about Lily's work and in the work that what we talked about today is that it really, while you're taking care of your baby and while you're eating these foods and really optimizing your pregnancy, you're also taking care of yourself in the process. By making sure that you yourself don't become depleted in these nutrients, you are giving yourself the ability to actually be present and be healthy when your baby comes. I think of this in two ways. One way from the perspective of the research and what it says, the sound science behind everything. But I also think of it in the way of my own lived experience as a mom. And so having gone through pregnancy and birth 2 times at the time of this recording, my youngest son is 2.5 and my eldest is 5. And so I've gone through this process of pregnancy and breastfeeding 2 times. And I can say that it's the time in your life that you are going to require the most nutrition, the most support, and also the most patience. It's very challenging to raise a child, and it's one of those times you never get a day off. You don't get a break. From the time your baby is born, your life has changed forever. And so we need to focus on the health of your baby, but we also have to focus on your health. So if you're coming out of pregnancy in the postpartum end deficient in all of these important nutrients, you're low on B12, you're low on iron, your thyroid isn't functioning properly, you have an iodine deficiency, and then perhaps potentially your baby is a little bit more colicky or fussy. I've spoken on the podcast before about how changing my diet really made a difference in the quality of my breast milk. So I noticed a really clear difference between the breast milk that I produced right after I had my first son versus even later on while he was a little bit older, and the breast milk that I produced when I had my youngest. And the diet that you eat definitely impacts the quality of your breast milk and how satisfying your baby will find that breast milk. So I guess all of this is to say that there's just so many things to consider. And as a mom, there's so many things that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And in order to make sure that you're at your best and you're really able to take care of your family, it really starts with your own health. It starts with that. And so definitely do what you can. Make sure that you're optimizing your health and your nutrition for your baby, but also do it for yourself, because that baby needs a mom who is present and able to take care of him or her. I can't stress how important it is, just from, like I said, both perspectives, from my lived perspective as a mom and also from the perspective of a practitioner and what the research has to show. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the show. I really appreciate all of you for supporting the show, for sharing the show with your friends, for sharing on social media and tagging your friends in posts. That's really how the show grows. That's how we get the word out. That's how we let more and more women know. And so I really appreciate all of you for being a part of that. If you're thinking about jumping into the next round of my Fertility Awareness Mastery Group Program, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information. If you haven't yet got a copy of my 3-part video series, it is free, and it's a great resource, especially if you're new-ish to fertility awareness, or even if you've been charting for a while and you're just wanting some additional information and support. You can head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam101 and get your hands on my free 3-part video series. And so with that said, I just want to thank you for listening today, and as always, be well and happy charting.